Betting, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Bet with the Best podcast. Its mission is to explore better ways to bet on races, to seek out new, successful players, and to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. The Bet with the Best podcast is sponsored by Amwager, an ADW built by horse players for horse players. Speed, power, and ease of use are at the core of Amwager, designed to give players the information and tools they need to quickly make anything from a simple win bet to a complex, structured superfecta or pick 5 wager. When you combine that with data and pool updates that are up to 60 times faster than the competition, Amwager is the clear winner in wagering on races online. Those are just a few of the many special features that Amwager has to offer, along with live video and race replays, free, integrated form-to-win past performance information, conditional wagering, and true odds, which are a prediction of off odds based on all available pool data. That and much more. Amwager is licensed and operated in the U.S., and best of all, they will actually pay you to play. If you sign up now and deposit and bet $150, you will earn a $150 lump sum bonus. So there is no reason not to give Amwager a try. If you want to bet with the best, then you need the best tools to wager with. You need Amwager. Welcome to episode 31 of the Bet with the Best podcast. Joining this week is a very busy guy. He's a DRF, Timeform US, and NYRA racing analyst, and he also does the morning line for NYRA. He's David Aragona, and he's here to discuss in depth with us handicapping and betting on races at Saratoga. Welcome to the show, David. How's it going?
Going pretty well, Chris. I've listened to quite a few of these, especially once you started out doing it. Some really interesting episodes, so I'm honored to be on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being a guest. And I'm sure the listeners will appreciate everything you have to share, because when it comes to racing in New York, I put you as, one of the sharpest guys out there. So I encourage anybody who doesn't follow David on Twitter or follow his analysis he does for NYRA and Timeform and DRF, you should do it, because it's definitely going to help you in terms of your handicapping and wagering on the races in the New York area. So let's get started. You've heard the show, so you know I like to kick it off with the Horseplayer origin story, how you got started in racing, and how it led to where you are today. So if you would share your Horseplayer origin story.
Well, I guess I'll go back quite a ways. My origin story, I think, is pretty typical. I got introduced to the sport by my dad and my uncle. Started going to the races with them. I'll actually go back a little bit further. Neither of them come from a racing background. And they actually got interested in the sport in the early 70s. They had a friend of theirs that was into racing at the time, and said to them, there's a race coming up that everyone's talking about. I think we should all go to see it and can kind of introduce you guys to horse racing. So he took them to the races, and it just so happened that the first time they went to the races was for Secretariat Belmont Stakes. And seeing that in person, I think, made lifelong fans out of both of them. So they just were really interested in the sport from that point forward. I think they both dived right in. They quickly learned about Saratoga, started going up there every summer. And I kind of came along and was exposed to it from a very young age. And my father had a ton of books around, had VHS tapes of old races he had taped. So I just had this library of information I could explore as a kid if I chose to do so, and I took an interest in it. So just over the years, learned more about handicapping, fascinated with seeing the races, learning about the races, and kind of just snowballed from there.
So how did you end up, going from the kid who was interested in the races and had access to some information and some mentors to the point where you're, doing analysis for NYRA and Timeform and DRF? How'd you make that leap?
Well, I guess when I was a kid, I was obviously fascinated with racing, and the handicapping process really intrigued me. I would say that there was a turning point moment when I was pretty young, because my dad and my uncle, they would go up to Saratoga for at least a week every summer. It was something they started doing in the mid-'70s. And when I was a little kid, they would have their weekly vacation up at Saratoga. And I would typically get together with my cousins and each of our moms. They would get together for a few days. We'd have a sleepover, and it would be fun. Like as a kid, you'd get to spend time at your cousin's house and do all that stuff. I think when I was 11 years old, my dad came to me and said, you seem like you're pretty interested in racing. How would you feel about us taking you along on this trip that we do every year? And you kind of have to skip the sleepover for a few days. You won't have fun with your cousins anymore, but you can come with us and see how Saratoga is. So it was a difficult decision for me at the time. I think I was 11, but I decided, all right, I'm going to go up to Saratoga with you guys. And from that point on, there was no turning back. Just being immersed in that environment and seeing the kind of handicapping they did, learning from them, going to the handicapping seminars they went to. I just loved all of it. And, from that point on through my teenage years into my 20s, I just was just a sponge for information about learning about handicapping, race watching, how to bet. So I would say that my interest in the sport kept growing and growing over that time. But what I didn't have was somebody who was my age or really any friends who were into the sport, aside from my dad or my uncle, who I would see once in a while. There was nobody I could really talk about horse racing with. I just didn't have anybody else in my network that had that same interest. So after college, I was kind of figuring out what to do with my life for a few years. I was working a job that I didn't really view as a long-term thing, but it was just kind of, in my lost years, figuring things out, where I wanted to go. And just as an outlet, as a hobby during that time, I started up a blog to write about horse racing. For me, it was a way to expand my network of people that I could talk to about the sport. And I figured if I put out in writing what I did, my handicapping opinions, I could connect with people who viewed races in a similar way and maybe have interesting conversations about it. And also for me, it would help me hone my skills of handicapping, writing about the races, learning what was the way to bet. I kind of decided early on I was going to track my performance and make sure I did a good job at it. So it was something I just did every day, writing NYRA analysis. And, for a good year of doing that, nobody was reading. I was just posting daily blog entries. My dad would read it. Maybe I'd get one or two hits from Google, but that was about it. But it was the kind of thing where I figured, this is a good exercise, even if no one's going to read it. It's the kind of thing that's actually helping me out. It's making me better. So I just kept at it. And there was one day, I think it was in late 2012, where, I did very similar to what I do now. I pick up 3 races at NYRA that I want to write about. And I wrote about 3 races in a day and, recommended 3 horses to bet. And it was kind of one of those magical days where all 3 horses won. One of them went off at upwards of 70-1, and another went off at upwards of 50-1. Those were among the 3 winners that day. And a set of results like that quickly, gets you a few more readers. And suddenly my readership, spikes from about maybe 10 people per day to over 100. And from there, I started to get a little bit more word of mouth going about the blog that I was writing. And I got to talk to a few people in the industry. There was a day, I think it was in 2014, where out of the blue, Andy Serling sent me a message and basically said, "Hey, I came across your blog. Some people have talked to me about it. I was reading what you're doing, and you seem like you're pretty sharp. How about you meet me in the city one day to grab lunch, and we can just talk about what you're doing in the horse racing industry." And that was kind of the first time that somebody who could do something for a career in racing for me reached out and wanted to, help out or just talk about what my interest was in that area. And nothing immediately came of that, but Andy has a lot of connections, so I never really asked him exactly how it came about. But a few months later, I heard from Mark Attenberg, who is the creator of Timeform US, and mentioned to me that there was going to be an opportunity to do a lot of what I had been doing for my own blog. I could do for Timeform US and basically start to use their those past performances in my writing. And I thought that sounded pretty appealing. So I signed on with him to start doing that. And from there, I think everybody else knows the story. Timeform US got folded into the Daily Racing Form, got the opportunity to start doing the NYRA Morning Lines. And now that's my current set of responsibilities.
That's a great story, and it's definitely a modern story. It's not one that I would hear from some of the older guests I've had on the show. They didn't start a blog online as their entry into the racing industry. So that's really great, and I think that's some words of encouragement for some of the younger players out there that are like you and kind of share this passion and. It was kind of neat that you were able to sort of connect with other people outside your personal sphere, but that shared that same passion. So really interesting story. That's a unique origin story. And we haven't had one quite like that on the show. So Saratoga played a big part in your getting, involved in racing. So what do you think is it that makes Saratoga, a special place?
I would say the thing that kind of hit me about Saratoga when I first started going there was every day is like a typical Saturday at another racetrack. Especially back in those early days when the meet was a little shorter, there would be a stakes race, often a graded stakes race, every single day. And, if we went up there for just a week, it used to be Wednesday through Monday, you'd see a stakes race with a noteworthy horse almost every single day. And that was just something that I didn't have exposure to prior to that. Usually, you'd go to the racetrack or there'd be one major race every week or something like that. But Saratoga just offered that concentration of the top racing. I think over the years, we've lost a little bit of that as the meet has gotten spread out over 40 days now and 8 weeks. The boutique nature of the meet, I think, is a little more diluted. But, still, it's by far the best thing that we've got. Aside from, obviously, Del Mar on the West Coast in terms of this area, it still brings together connections from other circuits, the best horses in the country, and also the best trainers and jockeys. And I think one of the things that makes Saratoga so appealing for horse players is that, especially if you're somebody who likes to play the long shots like I do, at Saratoga, you can find horses at big prices that go out for top connections, that are ridden by top jockeys, and are only flying under the radar because they're in races against other really tough competition, going out for connections that are strong and jockeys that are towards the top of the national standing. So I think Saratoga just provides great opportunities to see fantastic racing in terms of quality, great wagering opportunities. And then also, if you are lucky enough to actually go to Saratoga and physically be there in person, it's just taking in the history, the track, and, walking around that place. It's so easy to imagine what it was like 50, 100 years ago. And the town of Saratoga Springs, this is always so, just bubbling over during the summer, and you're always seeing people that are interested in racing. It's just a concentration of people that have that same interest in the sport that you love all in one place. And that's what makes Saratoga so special. I think what keeps so many people coming back to it every year.
It definitely is. The part you mentioned that really resonated with me when I go there is just how the community is so engaged in the racing. I mean, it really is a racing town, much more so than just about anywhere else. Maybe Lexington might be comparable, but it really is a racing town, and you sense that everywhere you go.
Yeah,
all right,
100%.
So
I echo all those sentiments.
So let's talk a little bit about the handicapping and betting on the races at Saratoga, because that's what people are most interested in, at least those that can't make it personally to Saratoga. And so let's start with just talking about how, what are the big differences, if there are any, between racing at Saratoga and the other New York tracks where most of the horses are coming in from. Typically it's Belmont, but we're kind of in this transition period, but in the future it'll be Belmont again, but Belmont or Aqueduct. I mean, how is Saratoga different either on the turf racing or dirt racing or the trainers, jockeys? I mean, what are the big differences, and what are the similarities between the normal New York racing and Saratoga?
I mean, I think the biggest difference is just the rise in quality. And I think you used to see it happen much more sharply when the meet was shorter, that as soon as you got there at the end of July, the racing would suddenly get a lot tougher than it was, especially for those final couple of weeks at Belmont, where maybe certain connections were saving up their best stock for Saratoga, and connections from Kentucky that you wouldn't see at Belmont would suddenly be showing up at Saratoga, and the racing would suddenly just get a lot tougher and more competitive than it was downstate. I think these days, that rise in quality is a little more gradual, especially towards the early part of the Saratoga meet these days. You see a lot of the same races or same horses, especially at the lower levels or for the New York breds, that maybe you would see at what is now Aqueduct or what used to be Belmont. And I think another thing that has gotten a little less different, especially in recent years, is the way that the track would play at Belmont, and especially the way that the turf courses are configured, is obviously very different than Saratoga. One thing that's interesting about running at Aqueduct in the spring and summer meet is that Aqueduct has almost the exact same configuration as Saratoga. It's a 1.1 1/8 dirt oval. They now have the 2 turf courses. The only real difference is the one-turn mile races that they can run at Aqueduct and can't run at Saratoga. And I guess with the turf racing, they run 5.5 at Saratoga, and they run up to 6 furlongs on the turf at Aqueduct. But generally, the races in terms of configuration are very similar. So you're kind of left with the competition being tougher. But like I said, it's a little more gradual. You definitely do get the jockey colony deepening right away, especially now that you've got certain jockeys like Jose Ortiz and Luis Saez spending the majority of the year in Kentucky. And when they come back to Saratoga, it does create that situation where you've got a lot more top jockeys showing up in all sorts of races, or maybe at Aqueduct, it would be a situation where certain horses are taking a lot more money because there's a huge disparity in quality or results for, among all the jockeys in the race. So I think you definitely do have that changing very quickly in terms of the connections that are participating. But I would say that over time, the changes that you see from Belmont and Aqueduct to Saratoga have gotten a little bit lessened.
But you did bring out a couple of things I want to follow up on that are definitely different. And one thing you mentioned was the 5.5 furlong sprints at Saratoga. You're right that at Aqueduct they don't go quite as long, but back and again in the future when they run at Belmont, they can go even 7 furlongs on the turf. So you have a lot of horses that have maybe been going longer distances in those turf sprints, and now they're cutting back to 5.5 furlongs. Is that something that you agree, it can be a big difference, and how do you factor that into, handicapping and betting?
Yeah, 100%. When you have those 6 and 7 furlong turf sprints at Belmont, I mean, it used to be a pretty unique thing. I think we see a little bit more of that these days, especially now that a lot of these horses race at Kentucky Downs, where they also have more of those elongated turf sprints. There's also the downhill course at Santa Anita, but we don't see too many horses coming in from there. Same thing with Woodbine. So, that Belmont to Saratoga transition can be pretty significant for the turf sprinters, because when you get down to those 5 and 5.5 furlong distances, it really takes a certain kind of horse, a specialist type. You need a lot of natural speed and quickness, agility, where maybe if you're going the 7 furlong distance at Belmont, the paces tend to be a little bit slower. So some horses who specialize going a 1 mile distance can more easily make that transition back to 7 furlongs, because there really isn't that big a difference between 1 mile and 7 furlongs at Belmont in the way those turf courses are configured, especially on the Widener. Whereas at Saratoga, if you're a route horse on the turf trying to make that turn back to 5.5 furlongs, those types often have a lot of difficulty doing so, because the paces are so much faster, and horses who don't have that speed to stay in attendance to a 44 and change half mile, they'll just completely lose contact with the field early. And at Saratoga, they don't run 5 furlongs. It is 5.5. And I think that makes it less of just a pure emphasis on speed, because you do see those races come apart sometimes. And what I like about the 5.5 furlong turf sprints at Saratoga is I think you tend to see some pretty competitive pace scenarios. And it's one of the few places at NYRA that you can consistently point to and say, the jockeys who ride these races and the trainers who enter them, they know the value of speed. And the horses that are typically running on these races are doing so because they have so much natural speed. You don't want to take away that weapon. So you do see some real hot paces develop going those distances. And even though they're short races, you can see closers do well in them also. So they're really fun races to handicap, especially when you get some larger fields.
Yeah, you make a good point. The difference between 5 furlongs and 5.5 is more than you would think in terms of, at 5 furlongs, horse races just don't typically fall apart, even with fast paces. Whereas that 5.5, just that extra half furlong can really make a difference. Okay, so the other, I think, kind of important distance change is on the dirt, and that's the 1.125 2-turn races that they have at Saratoga. That's kind of unique for New York, and before they added this sort of semi-chute, and we'll talk about in a minute, you had horses that, that was the choice. You could either, sprint or go 1.125 on the dirt. So it really is a true 2-turn route. So, what's your thinking on that? How do you factor that in? And, is that a big part of the way you handicap those races?
Yeah, I mean, that's a similar thing to when we get back to Belmont and we make that transition from Belmont to Saratoga for the dirt horses. They can run those long 1-turn routes on the dirt at Belmont, whereas at Saratoga, if you're going beyond, well, in the old days, if you were going beyond 7 furlongs, you'd have to go the 9 furlongs around 2 turns. And it can be a pretty demanding 9 furlongs. I mean, I think most handicappers know that it can be a little bit easier to trick a horse stretching out to go a route distance around 1 turn. You see those races at a 1-turn mile, sometimes a little bit easier for a horse that maybe accomplished 7 furlongs to stretch out to. When you make that horse go the 2-turn 9 furlongs, it can take a lot more stamina to do so. And those are races that really the true routers are the ones who excel. So I understand why some of the connections didn't always like when they had a horse maybe that would like to go 1 mile or 1 mile and 1/16 at Belmont or Aqueduct. And then you have to go the 1.125 miles if you want to stretch that horse out at Saratoga. It could be a difficult thing to do. So now that they've got the Wilson Chute and the ability to run those 1.5 turn miles, I think that's a nice bridge or middle ground that connections are taking advantage of. I know there's been a lot of discussion about those races, and kind of like the turf sprints when those were first added to the menu at Saratoga, it's something relatively new, and handicappers are going to have to adjust. I think we're still gathering data about those races. But as for the dirt track at Saratoga and just the way that it plays, we can see it be somewhat deep and tiring at times. So when you're handicapping those true 2-turn races, the 9 furlongs, the 1 3/16, the 1.25 miles, I think you're looking for horses that really do have the stamina to go that far.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that, but just the new Wilson Chute, it is new. You've seen it in action for a while. Is there anything that you've learned from what you've seen? Is there anything that are good takeaways for players that are going to be playing horses in that race, or horses that are stretching out or cutting back, or the pure milers? I mean, or does it play inside, outside, speed, closers, just anything that you gleaned from the racing they've had so far?
I wouldn't say that it's a kind of race that favors a particular running style. I think when we first started running them, I want to say it was back in 2022. I think it was a couple of years ago when they started those. I mean, some speed horses won the first few of them, and I think there was the narrative that you have to be a speed horse to win those races. When you're watching those races, I think you want to be aware that there's very little run up to them. So the fractions can be somewhat deceptive. I mean, I think raw fractions just are always a little deceptive, because in this country, we use run up for almost every distance. Almost every track uses a run up. And for those that don't know, the run up is the distance between the starting gate and the first pole at which the race timing actually begins. So if a race is being run at a mile and it's being run with an American style run up, then it's being run at a mile plus the amount in feet of whatever the run-up is. And I believe the run-up is very minimal for the Wilson Chute races. So that's why you often see a pretty slow opening quarter. In addition to that, they're going right into the turn. So I think the jockeys have to ride with at least a little bit of caution to get their horses to make that turn. So you typically see some slower paces than maybe you would expect from a 1 mile race run on a straightaway. But even if they go, let's say, low 47 to the half, that can be a pretty fast pace out of the Wilson Chute when you're talking about a dirt track that's playing at a pretty standard speed. So you will see those races come apart a little bit. They're not running particularly large fields out of the Wilson Chute. I think they're capping it at 10. So I think we've seen in some instances horses that get forward doing fairly well. That might just be a function of the way that the races shape up in terms of dynamics and the way that they have to ride around that turn. I did see some chatter about post position, and I think that there was an expectation when they started running those races out of the Wilson Chute that you wanted to be drawn down towards the inside. And I think that there were some people who saw the mile races from, I think it was the early 90s when they tried to run them for a little while, that would say that the rail was always the place to be in those races. I would say, having watched, I think it's been like almost 100 races out of the Wilson Chute at this point over the past 2 years and then some. I would say that if anything is true, it's actually the opposite, and that the inside positions can be a disadvantage at times, especially if you've got a horse that possesses early speed, let's say breaking from post 1 or post 2. That horse really needs to break sharply, because unlike in a mile race that's run on a straightaway, where everyone's kind of going in a straight line down the backstretch or making a gradual move towards the inner rail to make a turn that's maybe a half a mile away, when you're coming out of the Wilson Chute, you're going right into that turn. And anybody who breaks a little bit sharper than you to the outside is coming right down towards that inner rail. So a speed horse that's breaking from the inside really needs to be alertly away from the gate if they're going to be able to show that speed. So I think you want to be careful with horses that are drawn inside with running styles to need to be in front or need to be forward. And I'm not somebody who puts a lot of stock in raw post-position data. It's just, I know some people do well with it for themselves. It's just not a handicapping angle that I have felt has ever worked for me. But I have looked up some post-position data for the Wilson Chute. And if you're just looking at pure win rates, post 6 and 7 fare better than post 1 and 2, which I think is not what was the expected outcome when they started running out of that. And I think in horse racing, you always want to be aware when expectations are refuted by real data. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that with the Wilson Chute races.
Yeah, so if the horse has speed and breaks early, it could be an advantage to be on the rail. But if it doesn't, it could be turned into a real disadvantage. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, it sounds like.
Yeah, 100%. And I even think that breaking from the inside even if your horse breaks well, you still have to make that more gradual turn, make a sharper turn to the left than maybe a horse is breaking from an outside post position. So sometimes it might even be an advantage to be a little further outside because you can find your footing and go forward and get into that stride maybe a little bit more fluidly than a horse who's trying to rush up through from the inside, even if they break alertly.
Yeah, that makes sense. The geometry kind of makes it easier to go from the gate into that turn if you're farther out. So one of the things that I've noticed about the main track is that even on days when it's not wet, it's raining, it seems like they put a lot of water on it, and it almost seems, if I just look at it on the television, it almost looks like a sealed wet fast track when they water it. Maybe that's just an illusion, but it does seem like the kickback can be an issue for some of the closers on the main track. You have any opinions on that?
Kickback definitely is an issue. I think it's become more of an issue at the New York racetracks in recent years. I think they've changed the composition of the dirt tracks. Definitely at Saratoga, gosh, it's probably half a decade ago now. And since they did that, it does feel like the tracks are a little more speed favoring. I think it's a little bit lazy just to say that speed wins all the races at Saratoga, because it's not true, and it's definitely a track that's affected by weather and maintenance. But I think you do find overall at Saratoga, when we're talking about a fast track, that you need to be a little more forgiving of horses that seem to not be handling the kickback than maybe somewhere else where that's less of an issue, like Churchill Downs, let's say, where it seems like horses don't have a whole lot of trouble running through the kickback there. For whatever reason, it's a different story at Saratoga, where especially you've got 2-year-olds. You could see it when you watch a lot of the head-on replays. There are some horses that just really don't handle that dirt being kicked back in their face. And I think if you're a trip handicapper, you definitely want to be aware of the horses that are running through it and those that aren't. And sometimes it is a distinction between inexperienced horses and horses with experience, but there are other situations where there are just days where even, hardened allowance horses or stakes horses just don't seem to be able to make up ground through the kickback. And I think we saw some of that during that Belmont Stakes Racing Festival weekend, where speed was doing very well. And I think there are a couple of contributing factors there. One was the kickback, which did seem to be affecting some horses. And the other was just the track was playing extremely fast. It was yielding some very fast times. And when you see a track yielding fast times like that, and whatever is going on with the track surface that's really just helping the horses bounce off it and achieve those fast times, the front runners aren't getting as tired as they typically would over a deeper surface. And that can lead to a situation where speed is doing a little bit better. But I definitely do think that there are some unique factors to take into account when you're handicapping the dirt racing at Saratoga.
Yeah, so there's only a few days to go on, but how do you think the track is playing now relative to how it played in the special Belmont at Saratoga meet, or how it's played in the past? Does it pretty much look like it always has, or have you noticed anything early on?
I think the baseline for the Saratoga main track these days is that it's just slightly speed favoring. Dirt in general, anywhere you find it, is a little speed favoring. And I think the Saratoga maybe just is a little bit more speed favoring than your average dirt track, just as a baseline. It was definitely playing a little more speed than that in early June for that Belmont Stakes Racing Festival. As far as the first week of this Saratoga summer meet, I think it was pretty typical of what we usually see at Saratoga. It seemed like a fair racetrack. There were definitely some races where it was dominated towards the front end, but I think in those situations, you don't want to just rely on the results or just look at who was forward. There were definitely some pace scenarios that contributed to those situations. Like I think of that mile and 1/8 race on opening day. I think it was the 9th race of the day, that allowance event that looked like it could have been a stakes race won by that Phil Bauer horse, Warrior Johnny. And he was kind of the only horse to make up any significant ground in that race. He actually ran an amazing race if you go back and watch the start and the entire replay. But after taking in that race, I heard some people saying, oh, it's another speed favoring track. But then you have to go back and look at the pace. And they went 48 to the half with a final time for a mile and an eighth of 1:47.4. I mean, that's always going to be a situation where it's almost impossible to close. So was it the pace that made it impossible to close, or was it a speed favoring track? I think it's definitely the former in that situation. So in terms of the first 4 days of the meet, luckily we haven't gotten too much significant rain yet. And it seems like when the track has been fast, it's been pretty fair so far.
So let's move on to the turf course. You've mentioned there are two turf courses, one inner and then the main turf course, I guess you'd call it. Any distinctions you make between those two in terms of how you handicap the races? Any characteristics of one that varies from the other, or anything about, those turf or other turf courses in general?
I think if there's any distinction to make, it is that it sometimes is a little bit easier to close on the melon turf course, which is the outer turf course. I think some handicappers would say that. Personally, I don't know if I subscribe to that. And when I'm doing my handicapping, I don't always think so much about, oh, I want a certain running style on the melon course versus the inner course. At Saratoga these days, to maintain the quality of the turf courses, they are moving the rail settings. And what I mean by rail settings is the temporary rail that they set up that's usually away from the hedge. They are moving it just about every week of the meet on both courses. So I think what you really want to pay attention to when you're playing the turf races at Saratoga is how it's playing at each of those rail settings on either course. Sometimes when the rail is way out there, it can be a little more speed favoring and it's tougher to close. Sometimes when there's no temporary rail set up and they're running right down on the hedge, that fresh ground that hasn't really been trodden yet is where you want to be. And you see a lot of horses that are just riding the rail or riding the hedge every step of the way seem to have an advantage on those types of courses. Typically, I don't think they take down the rails completely until about Travers weekend. I think that's how they've been doing it lately on the Saratoga courses. But I would pay a lot more attention to that. And I think if you're looking for stuff like that, you want to pay attention to what's going on Wednesday, right after they've moved the rails, see how the courses are playing that day. And maybe that can inform some of the decisions that you make heading into the weekend about how the courses are going to be playing and what kinds of running styles or trips you're really looking for on the turf.
That's a really good point. That's some good advice that the listeners can take advantage of. So you mentioned a little bit about the weather, and that maybe is the biggest downside of Saratoga, is just the unpredictability of the weather and kind of the violent nature of it sometimes. How do you adjust for that? How can you adjust for that? And, what does the track off play like when you get a downpour? How does that affect typically either the turf courses or the main track?
It's tough to do a lot of handicapping for wet tracks, at least in the position that I'm in at Saratoga, because, I work for the Daily Racing Forum. We love to put our picks out days in advance. We have a print form and got to get all that stuff in sometimes 24, 36 hours, I should say 48 to 72 hours ahead of time. So you really can't plan for the weather in those situations when you're making picks. In terms of betting the races, once I see what weather has happened and the results in terms of how the races have changed since I first handicapped them, because I'm handicapping all of these races, for the morning line or the picks that I do days and days in advance. I think it is kind of helpful to go back on the day of the race and reassess things, especially after scratches, because on days that do feature a lot of rain like that, and you've got the surface changes or even in the scheduled dirt races, scratches due to weather, you want to assess how all of that has changed. And Saratoga, when it gets really wet, you can sometimes see track biases occur, whether it's a speed bias. Sometimes when the track gets really wet, the rail is not the place to be, and you see a lot of jockeys avoiding the inside. But those are tough things to predict ahead of time. I would say if there is something that you want to expect when the rain is like actively coming, sometimes you see more of a speed bias when the track is sealed, and maybe when the track is drying out, that's when you tend to see more of a dead rail situation, but it doesn't always hold true to be the same that way. A lot of it depends on how they're maintaining the track and what work they're doing to get it to dry out. So I find it tough in the moment to sort of predict how the races are going to go based on any track profile from the weather. More so on days where it's rained a lot, I'm just kind of playing with a little less confidence or less volume than I would on a typical Saratoga day, because one of the great things about Saratoga is you've got 40 days of just awesome racing. And if there's one day where a bunch of races you were interested in came off the turf, or maybe you see a track bias starting to develop early in the day, maybe I'm going to abandon some of the opinions that I have or play them in, with much less confidence than I otherwise would have, because I'm sure there's going to be another card tomorrow or a day or two away that is much more worth the money that I was thinking about spending on this one.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice as well. I mean, learning how to pass a race is as important as learning how to, play one. Being able to pick and choose your spots is really important if you want to be successful. Anything else on the track in general? I'm going to get into some other questions, but anything else you want to add about either of the tracks or, anything we've talked about so far?
In terms of just a follow up on the previous question with off the turf races, and I think the thing that you want to pay attention to at Saratoga is an off the turf situation where a race is being misbet, because you do sometimes see turf horses take a lot of money on the dirt, especially if it's going out for top connections or like the rare Chad Brown turf horse that gets left in on the dirt. I think you want to focus on dirt form in a lot of those races. And I think there is an opportunity on days when it rains to do well in off the turf races. I know some people are specialized more in that than others do, but still, I mean, they're races that are a little different than what the connections or were expecting when they entered. So I think just add that extra layer of unpredictability into the mix. So I think you want to try to find opportunities there where they may be. You don't want to just ignore them, but you also want to proceed with a little bit of caution. And yeah, in terms of the surfaces and the configuration of the track, I mean, there's not too much else that I want to point out. I mean, you do see the first 2-year-old races that are run around 2 turns on the turf anywhere at NYRA. At Saratoga, they start to run those mile and a 16th maiden special races for the 2-year-olds. I think I think there's one actually coming up this weekend, so the middle of July now. And those are races that can produce some trips or some horses that just aren't ready for what's thrown at them at the moment. So I think you definitely do want to watch trips in all situations at Saratoga, but especially in those races, because you could definitely find some interesting things going on.
Well, you brought up 2-year-old races. That's a big part of Saratoga racing on the main track as well. So maybe talk a little bit about how do you approach these races where you've got a field full of horses. Sometimes none of them have ever had a race. How do you handicap that? And from your perspective, how do you make a morning line on those? What can you do, if anything, to tackle those races?
I would say I've grown to really enjoy those races from a lot of perspectives. They used to be races that I wouldn't be very interested in betting, and I've kind of had to force myself to get more interested in betting them over the past several years, because I've kind of realized that I've become a lot better at them than I used to be, just through the necessity of having to do a lot more work and fact finding on those races for making the morning line. And it's one of the few situations where I feel like making the morning line has actually helped my handicapping a lot with a specific type of race. And that would be those 2-year-old maiden special weight races. Yeah, I mean, first of all, in terms of making the morning line for those races, I think a lot of it is determined by connections and what you see on paper. And making the line for those races isn't as hard as I think some people might make it out to be. I know, like, people who want to praise me for doing a good job on a morning line will often point to those 2-year-old races, and I'll kind of think like, well, I don't know, that was one of the easier ones to make, because I mean, you kind of see a lot of the factors that move the board staring at you. Once in a while, you'll find those situations where maybe there's a connections or a trainer that doesn't typically send out a live firster, and I'll look up the workout videos, and I couldn't do that job effectively if I didn't have resources like XBTV or some of those Kentucky workouts that you now have access to see videos of, because I am not one of those people who's waking up at the crack of dawn to go see workouts in person. So seeing those videos of the works, it gives me some insight into how different horses that are making their debuts have been training. And once in a while, you'll see some lower profile connections have a horse that's really training out of its skin, or is just showing apparent talent in the morning. And those are the situations where I feel like, okay, I can get this one right, because I know that this is a horse that is going to move the board, because people have access to very sophisticated information in Saratoga, more so than almost any other meet anywhere in the country. Workout reports are the information from workouts. It's prevalent and it's moving the tote board. So to kind of be aware of that stuff and factored into the morning line, I hope it's helping the people that are betting on the races when I use that stuff, or when I allow that stuff to factor into the lines that I make. But in terms of actually handicapping and betting those races, it's a little trickier, because what I've learned is I might see talent in a certain horse and be able to make that horse a short price on the line, but those aren't always the right horses to bet in the race, because it's not a great strategy to bet a lot of short price first time starters. You can go broke pretty quickly doing that. But what you do find at Saratoga are horses that might be working well, but aren't putting forth the kind of workouts that necessarily are going to move the board. Or maybe a horse will be working well, but it'll be in the same maiden race where there are 4 other horses that are working really well. And maybe those 4 other horses are going out for Chad Brown, Todd Pletcher, Brad Cox, and somebody else, who, let's say Cherie DeVoe, another trainer who takes a lot of money these days. And you'll find a horse like, I think a good example is the last loaded maiden race from this most recent Saturday, where Dallas Stewart sent out that first time starter that was plainly apparent on the page, working really well. Every sign that you could see with that horse said, this is a live firster. By complexity, who's had a ton of success early on with the 2-year-olds. But that horse got let go at 6-1 because it was in a race with other horses that had already done some running or were going out for top connections. There was a Todd Pletcher horse that was working as well as a typical Todd Pletcher first-time starter at Saratoga, nothing special, but took all the money because it was a confusing race. And I think a lot of the bettors just settled on the known commodity, which is Todd Pletcher doing well in 2-year-old races at Saratoga. And that Dallas Stewart horse flew under the radar, whereas maybe if you reverse the workouts and every other attribute for that horse and put Todd Pletcher's name on Tough Catch, the Dallas Stewart horse, that horse probably would have been 8-5, not 6-1. So I think you have to look for those types of situations at Saratoga, and you can find opportunities to do well in the 2-year-old races there, because there are going to be runners that have real talent that don't necessarily go off at particularly short prices.
So beyond the connections and the workouts, is there anything else that you factor in your handicapping of those 2-year-old races?
I mean, I could get into like a deeper discussion of what you're looking for in workouts, because I think that's a whole other topic. And it's something that I've had to teach myself a little bit. I mean, I'm listening to people who are good at watching that stuff as I learn about it, because I don't come from a clocker background. I don't come from a horseman background. So I don't naturally know a lot of these things about what to look for in terms of a horse's movement or what the exercise rider is asking. But just through watching hundreds and hundreds of workouts as I made the morning line at Saratoga over the past 6 years or so, I feel like I've learned some things about what you're supposed to look for in those workouts, and things that you want to look for specific to the situation that the horse is facing on debut. When you're watching those gate works, I mean, you want to pay attention to a horse that doesn't look like it has no clue what it's doing coming out of the gate. You want to find a horse that looks like it's ready to win early. Sometimes you'll find a 2-year-old at Saratoga that's training really well, and a trainer will put it in company with an older, more experienced horse, and it'll hold its own. But it being Saratoga with a lot of expensive pedigrees debuting, it might be a son of Curlin that is ultimately going to be better going a longer distance. And that horse might take a lot of money, And maybe that's not the day to capitalize on that horse's talent. And maybe there'll be a horse with a more precocious pedigree, or that's shown a little more precocity in its morning workouts that maybe won't take as much money. So I think, like with everything, you want to let price be the guide. You want to try to find the value. And there are situations where the hype train can just run in overdrive on a horse that maybe isn't the best suited to a particular situation for winning on debut at a sprint distance, if we're talking about the shorter 2-year-old race at Saratoga. So I try to look for horses that I think are going to fit the situation well. And like I said, it's hard to go in all the particulars of what you look for in workouts, because I feel like you get into a lot of intangible things, or a lot of stuff that comes down to gut feeling, or just kind of knowing what you're seeing. Hard to put into words exactly how to spot a horse that's going to excel in a specific situation. But it is one of those situations where I find myself relying on gut feeling a lot. And, gut feeling is something that I think you encounter a lot as being a horse player. And it might sound like a cop-out answer, but gut feeling is not just something that you're pulling from the ether. It's your own educated guess. It's the feeling that something is going to happen based on all of your years and instances of watching something happen over and over again. And it just gives you that sixth sense that you're looking at that you're seeing a pattern emerge that you can pick out is going to actualized in a situation that you're presented with. I'm wording that very badly, but I'm just trying to make the point that gut feeling is not just, oh, well, I like this horse's name, so I'm going to go with it. It's, I feel like I'm seeing something that I know has had success in the past, and I'm just going to rely on myself that this is the angle that'll be worth betting on today.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. I mean, the intuition you have is based on all the experiences you've had in the past. And if you're good at learning from the past, then your intuition's probably well meant. So I absolutely get, even though you can't quite pinpoint what it is that you're seeing, oh, this is either good or this is bad, or this is something I want to avoid, or this is something I want to go after, without really being able to articulate exactly why, I think is what you're saying. And I think that's absolutely true. And you can trust your intuition more if you have a lot of experience and you've had success in the past. I think where you got to be careful is if you don't have that experience and you haven't had that success, maybe your intuition isn't the thing you want to follow in every instance.
Yes, you put that, I think, much better than I did, but I completely agree with the way that you phrased that.
So yeah, trust your intuition you have to, and believe in your opinion. But you want to make sure that you have had the experience and success that you want to rely on before you start doing that on a regular basis. Okay, so moving on, we talked about 2-year-old races. Now, at Saratoga, I want to talk a little bit about, are there certain stables, either owners or trainers, that really, really want to win at Saratoga, and you need to put a little extra, give them a little extra credit for the horses they're entering, at least assuming that they have been pointed to the race and are well meant, or is it more just like any other track? And the other question that comes up a lot at Saratoga is, horses for courses. Are there, certain horses that really do excel at Saratoga, either on the main track or on the turf or sprinting or routing? Anything like that, unique to Saratoga in terms of the horses or the connections?
I mean, I think that definitely is a thing. There are definitely connections that point to Saratoga, and sometimes that results in a trainer having a strong meet. Sometimes you plan to do well at Saratoga and it goes up in flames. I think we experience that as handicappers too. I mean, we spend a lot of time handicapping these cards and, intend to invest a lot, and sometimes the best laid plans don't work out. So I think you do want to be aware of those things, but also kind of realize that just because the trainer had a hot Saratoga last year doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to have the same ammo to have a strong Saratoga meet the next year. I think about Linda Rice, who seemed like she couldn't be beat last year at Saratoga. Really exploited a situation where she could go into Kentucky and claim a lot of really nice horses, bring them to New York and find spots for them where they fit really well. And she just, went on a tear for like the first 3 to 4 weeks of that meet last year. And I was reading an article a few days ago from Dave Grenning, who, had done an interview with Linda, and she basically said, don't expect me to have another meet like last year because I just don't have the horses. Couldn't claim those horses out of Kentucky again, or certainly not as many, and just don't have the horses to fit the right kinds of races anymore. And I'm sure Linda Rice is going to win her fair share of races at Saratoga because she's one of the top barns in New York, but it really depends on who's in the barn at that moment. And then, there are some trainers that come in from out of town, and it's a different situation a little bit because those trainers are kind of selecting the horses that they think can compete at Saratoga. I think the name that a lot of people have caught on to in recent years is Phil Bauer, who has, selected some horses who really seem to be able to compete at the levels at which they're pointed at Saratoga. And he's had some very successful meets for a few years running now. But then again, people catch on to these things. And I think a lot of people who bet these races tend to look for those hot barns. And I would say gone are the days when you're getting great value on those Phil Bauer horses. I mean, maybe the winner on the first day, Warrior Johnny notwithstanding, he was a decent price, but that was a really tough race. I mean, he was 9-1 because the competition was really tough, and 9-1 was probably the right price on him. I think you're seeing a lot of those horses take a lot of money. So I don't know if those are angles that I personally look to exploit. I'm not somebody who puts a ton of emphasis on connections when I'm doing my handicapping. I like to look at trainer stats. I use Deere Formulator a ton to look up different statistics in various situations for a trainer, but I'm not always looking for like, okay, I need to bet Cherie DeVoe in this particular kind of race because I have the sense that she always does well with these types of horses. That's not really the way that I handicap. I do try to pay attention to patterns that trainers develop and what they seem to, what their intentions seem to be, where they're placing their horses, how they're developing their careers. But that's more something I try to keep in the back of my mind. It's not always informing exactly who I want to bet in a given situation.
So what about horses dropping in class at Saratoga? Are there, normally you might think, well, this horse is dropping. It might be for negative reasons. But, are there trainers that will just drop horses in class just to win at Saratoga? And I'm thinking in particular, some of the top barns like Pletcher and Brown, when they drop a horse in for a tag, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I know you're going to say it depends, but are you maybe more inclined to think this horse is still can run some when they're at Saratoga versus if they were at Aqueduct? I'm just curious how you deal with those horses dropping in class.
Yeah, with almost every answer I'm going to give, I think the "it depends" can be understood because every situation is a little different. But I understand the premise of your question. Saratoga is a place where connections like to win. And I think there is an understanding that at Saratoga, a horse that might be a $40,000 claimer a month ago at Aqueduct is not going to win a $40,000 claimer at Saratoga because those races typically have a lot of drop downs. They come up a little tougher. You've got horses coming in from different circuits. So you do see drops in that situation. I think there's that kind of drop where a trainer is dropping just to find the level at which their horse is going to be competitive, which I don't think is a big red flag. I think if a trainer is doing his due diligence or her due diligence, they're just trying to find a realistic spot. And, I mentioned Linda Rice. I think she's probably one of the best at that, trying to find horses, spots where horses are going to be competitive. You don't see too many Linda Rice horses going off at huge prices for a reason because they're spotted in races to be competitive. And then there is a kind of, just like through the floor drop downs, somebody who's dropping a horse from, 50,000 down to 16,000, let's say. And those are the kinds of drops that I think you do have to be a little bit skeptical of, because even though maybe the owner is going for a win at Saratoga, they're probably going to lose the horse because people love to claim at Saratoga. You see tons of claims get put in these claiming races. So you might be taking a loss on the day, even with whatever the purse payout is going to be for the winning share. So is a win worth that connections? I mean, maybe in some cases it is. And, winning these trainers' titles and owners' titles, it does really matter to a handful of people. But I think you've got to be a little bit skeptical in some of those situations. I mean, there was one last, I want to say it was Sunday at Saratoga, where there was a Mike Rapoli horse, I think it was the 8th race of the day, who was dropping out of some high-level optional claiming allowance races into, I want to say it was a 25,000 condition claimer. And it was a horse that was trained by Norm Cassie, which is whatever. Rapoli has started to branch out and use some different trainers aside from just Pletcher. So that wasn't a red flag that it was a Cassie horse, but more so just the severity of the drop and the fact that Rapoli is one of those guys that likes to win a lot of races at Saratoga, likes to be in the mix for the owner's title. And is this one of those drops that you can say, okay, they're just losing this horse because they want to get the W and move on? But is this also maybe a horse that is dropping for a real reason? Maybe it's a physical reason, or maybe it's just a horse that has been running even a little worse than it looks on paper, or hasn't been doing well in the mornings. And I would say, I think I picked the horse on top just by, I just gave up on the race because it was frustrating me. But I think I made the wrong move in that situation, because it was a horse that had no early speed and was a deep closer. And if I could give one piece of advice in those races, it would be if you see a significant drop down like that, I'm a little more confident in those drop downs when it's a horse that has some amount of tactical speed or speed, as opposed to a horse that needs to pass everybody or has no speed whatsoever, because those horses still need to do some work during the race to overcome the kickback or show some willingness to put in an effort to get there. Whereas a horse who just gets to the front end and can relax sometimes will be able to have their confidence boosted right from the start by bossing around some inferior competition. So I think that was a great example of the kind of horse that you're supposed to be against from last Sunday, because the horse had no early speed, was taking a suspicious drop, and I think you saw in the running of the race that the connections made the right decision to drop.
Yeah, the front runner versus closer and rise and drop in class is really interesting. I mean, sometimes closers can actually get a better setup up in class because the pace is quicker than they do at the lower class, whereas it's kind of the opposite with the front runners. Typically that rise in class means you're going to have, a faster pace, more pressure. So that was always been an angle that I kind of look at, is the running style and factor. I like the way you factored that into the class drop or even a class rise. That's a good point. Okay, that wraps up part 1 of this podcast on betting and handicapping Saratoga with David Aragona. We appreciate your listening and hope you'll join us for part 2, which will come out in about a week. But for now, I want to thank you all for listening and thank David for being a guest. And may you all boldly go where no horse player has gone before.